You okay? Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Morning. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and wrapping up our theme week of Local Food Sourcing Week, we're fortunate to have Sarah and Kelly Schott joining us today. Sarah began working for the Ohio Department of Wildlife in 2020 and is currently a wildlife communications specialist for Northwest Ohio. She graduated from the Ohio State University with a major in natural resource management and a minor in community outreach education in 2021. Sarah has been hunting, fishing, birding, hiking, and exploring for her entire life. And Kelly has been with the Ohio Division of Wildlife since 1993, working several positions at Killdeer Plains and McGee Marsh Wildlife areas, as well as the Castalia State Fish Hatchery. Currently, she is the McGee Marsh Education Specialist, overseeing the Visitor Center and special events on or in the area. Being outside is a way of life for the Schott family, and she is proud to say that wild game is a staple on their dinner table. And for today's presentation is conservation, hunting, and fishing. Sarah and Kelly will lead this interactive talk about the past, present, and future of hunting and fishing in the state of Ohio. And as always, I ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Sarah and Kelly.
Thank you. We're really happy to be here today. I am Sarah, by the way, and this is Kelly. We are a mother-daughter team, so if there's a little bit of banter, that is why. But as John said, I am a wildlife communications specialist for Ohio Division of Wildlife. And so my job, in short, just a little bit, is to educate folks like you guys, all the way from, I've done programs for preschoolers, all the way up to retirement communities. So everybody in between, all walks of life, just my job is to educate people about wildlife, birding, hunting, fishing, all those resources that we have out there to enjoy our wildlife. And I do that in the 20 northwest counties in Ohio here. And if you want to tell what you
My name is Kelly, and I work for the Ohio Division of Wildlife as well. I work at McGee Marsh Wildlife Area. Have any of you ever visited McGee yet? All right, perfect. So I oversee the visitor center there. If you have not seen the new visitor center, I invite you to come out and see it. It's absolutely amazing. We renovated it just about a year and a half ago, and the displays are awesome. But I'm working there now overseeing the visitor center and all the public events that happen there at McGee. So that's about it. And I'll let Sarah get started.
Yeah, so we're going to talk to you guys about several different topics here, but our focus is kind of about hunting and fishing in Ohio and how that really attributes to conservation. But in order to get to that point, I'm going to give you a little briefing about our agency, just in case you aren't maybe familiar with us. So Division of Wildlife is actually a division underneath ODNR. And ODNR stands for Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And our mission from ODNR standpoint is to ensure a balance between the wise use and protection of our natural resources for the benefit of all. And whenever I tell people that mission, I say it's pretty broad. We just say natural resources, the wise use, protection. Those are kind of broad statements, but that is because we have all of these divisions and offices that are working to accomplish that mission. So we have Division of Wildlife, which is who Kelly and I are representing today. We have our Ohio State Parks and Watercraft, who you've probably heard of before if you visited a state park. We have our Division of Forestry, Division of Coastal Management. We have lots of different divisions who are accomplishing that natural resources benefit for all mission statement there. And each one of these divisions is working on something specific. So as you can imagine, we are talking about wildlife here today. So we are with the Division of Wildlife. We are focusing on wildlife. We're focusing on the living creatures out there on the landscape. That doesn't mean that we don't care about the water or the forestry. We deeply care about those things because those make up the wildlife habitat. But our sister division at Division of Forestry is looking more at our forests. Our Division of Water is looking more at our water resources. We all work together, but we have different focuses so that we can accomplish that big mission statement. So there's our logo there in the middle. That is who we are representing here today. And our mission, a little bit more specific, is to conserve and improve fish and wildlife resources and their habitats for the sustainable use and appreciation by all. So what that really means is when the division was founded, Right now, 151 years ago, in 1873, we were founded as the Ohio Fish Commission. We were really founded to look at and protect things like hunting, fishing, and trapping. We were founded as the Ohio Fish Commission solely based to look at the fisheries. So we were very focused on what fishing opportunities were available. That expanded to include all of our land animals, and it included hunting and trapping. And we were founded on the basis that we are going to enforce and regulate the hunting, fishing, and trapping laws. And we'll look at that a little bit later. But as modern eras come around, that mission also includes wildlife watching, kayaking, paddling, whatever it means for you to enjoy wildlife is what we are trying to manage that habitat for. And what I always like to tell people a lot when I'm introducing the Division of Wildlife is we don't own the wildlife. So Kelly and I, we don't own the wildlife here in Ohio. All wildlife in Ohio and across the nation is held in a public trust. And basically what that means is the wildlife out there doesn't belong to me or to one of you or to the governor or to our wildlife officers. It belongs to all of us as a whole. And we are just the trusted agency with the professionals, the biologists, the knowledge that are managing it for you. So the same thing is that you definitely wouldn't want me doing a heart operation on you, because I am not trained in that. That's not something that I should be doing on you guys. I am trusting a doctor to do that, that service to myself or somebody else. You all are entrusting our biologists and our professionals to manage this resource in the best interest of you all. So that in short is what that means. But just keep in mind that when we're talking about the Division of Wildlife, we're talking about however you can enjoy wildlife, whether it's hunting, fishing, trapping, birding, hiking, exploring. That is what we are trying our best to manage that for. All right, so we have lots of different funding sources for the Division of Wildlife. And our primary sources, and we'll dive into this a little bit more, is that our primary funding comes from sportsmen and women. So we're looking at hunters, anglers, and trappers. And our main source of funding are those two bullet points there at the top. They are coming from the sales of hunting and fishing licenses, and they are coming from federal excise taxes called the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingell-Johnson Act. And those are some important acts there to remember, because I'll hit on them, I think, 3 more times throughout the presentation. Kind of more modern day, what those are referred to collectively is the Sport, Fish, and Wildlife Restoration. And that is a logo that kind of goes along with it. So if you are, a lot of our boat ramps will have this logo on them, like the Dempsey Fishing Access or the Missouri Fishing Access. If you're ever out there and you see that logo is basically saying that this was paid for from federal excise taxes. And what these excise taxes are, they're an extra tax that are put on the sportsmen when they go to purchase a firearm or if they're purchasing ammunition. And that is the Pittman-Robertson Act. So it's an extra tax on hunting equipment. The Dingell-Johnson Act is basically the same thing. It's just applied to fishing equipment. So that is a motorboat fuel tax or a boat tax that is focusing on angling. Respectively, if you're buying a boat fuel and there's that tax on the Dingell-Johnson Act, that is going towards anything to do with fishing, so fishing accesses, things like that. These acts have been around for a very long time, and they have brought in a lot of money. We will look at some of those figures later, but they are extremely, extremely important to not just the Ohio Division of Wildlife, but every state here in the United States, because every state, I would say, relies heavily on these sources of funding. We'll talk about how those are distributed later, but just know that our federal excise taxes from the sport, fish, and wildlife restoration are coming from those hunters and anglers, as well as the purchasing of their hunting and fishing licenses. We also have different things like legacy plates, the legacy stamp, license plates, other sources of funding. Some people will donate via the tax checkoff. We get funding from that as well. But then what I always point out is we have a very minimal funding from the general revenue or the capital bond dollars. So we are not funded by your taxes. Some of our sister divisions are funded by taxes, but we are not. We get very minimal source of funding from the general revenue, and every time we do that, it has to be approved by the governor. So we have, and this is very new within the past few years. Historically, all of our funding has come from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. And what that funding looks like, it looks like about 750,000 acres of public land called wildlife areas, which is this yellow sign here. And these wildlife areas are a little bit different from our state parks in that think of them as more of a wilderness area. We don't have a lot of accommodations or playgrounds or visitor centers. We have some exceptions to that we're working on, including McGee that we'll talk about later. But these are very rustic areas. We try to keep them there for the wildlife. And the contrast of that is our state parks. So there's a place for everything, right? And our state parks have more of those paved trails or playground areas, a lot of things more managed for the people. But we like to have this healthy balance where we have places where people can go out and really enjoy the outdoors, and then also these more rustic areas to give that wildlife an opportunity to thrive and also make them accessible for people to go enjoy that wildlife. We also manage about 2.3 million acres of water. That includes Lake Erie, the Ohio River, and everything in between. And then we also have a law enforcement section. So we have a wildlife officer in every county that is in charge of making sure that our hunting and fishing regulations are being followed. They also assist with any questions that people have about wildlife. So they're a very important resource that we have. We'll talk about them a little bit more later as well. And then we have wildlife education is very important to us. So that's what we're here doing today. We recognize that in order to get people to appreciate, conserve, and help our wildlife, we have to teach them about it. We have to get them to respect those things. So that's very important to our agency as well. All right, so that's kind of the things that we have to get out of the way, right? We have to talk about the agency and know where we came from. But this is kind of what we're here to learn about today. So what we're going to cover is what is hunting and what is conservation and how do those work together and how are they, maybe sometimes they differ in people's opinions. We'll look at the wildlife in Ohio over time because in the past couple hundred years, we've gone through a lot of changes. We're going to look at how hunting and fishing benefits conservation. We'll have a little ending where we talk about McGee Marsh Wildlife Area, the history of it, what it looks like today, and hopefully encourage you guys to either get out and visit it again, or if you haven't been there yet, definitely make it something to do on your list. And then we will also send you off with some ways that you yourself can be a conservationist. So the first thing that we'll take a look at is that hunting versus conservation. So there's going to be a word pop up here, and if you're feeling brave and you want to shout it out, I want you to kind of maybe say the first thing that comes to your mind. It can be a memory, it can be a show, it can be what you think the definition is. But go ahead, and if we have any brave volunteers, tell me what you think of right away when you think of hunting. Guns, yep. Arrows, bows. Anybody think of like a definition? What does using firearms or guns or bows and arrows, what can we formulate from a definition that hunting would mean? Yeah. Killing a wild animal, harvesting a wild animal. And in short, that is our definition here. The act of pursuing and killing or harvesting a wild animal for sport or food. And we're going to look at the transformation of hunting over the past several hundred years. And it really it was a primary source of way of people to live from that food standpoint. And now here today, it's more of a hobby. But that is the definition of hunting. All right, we have one more word. Let's take a look at conservation. So what are things that come to mind when you think about that? Responsible, I like that one. Did you say wetlands? Wetlands, I like that one. All right, so our definition with the Division of Wildlife of conservation is the wise use of a natural resource. And that's where that responsible comes into play. Conservation is different from preservation. Preservation is we're preserving it, we're not necessarily touching it. Conservation is we're still using it, we're using it in a responsible way. So when we look at these two definitions, we see the definition of hunting is to pursue and kill a wild animal for sport or food, and our definition of conservation is the wise use of a natural resource. And using these definitions, we could draw this conclusion that hunting is conservation. Because the definition of hunting is we're harvesting a wild animal. The definition of conservation is we're doing it in a responsible way. So hunting is different from poaching, and a lot of people will think of poaching equals bad, and therefore poaching isn't conservation. But when we're talking about hunting, this means that it is in fact conservation. Now, how many have seen this screenshot? Yes, we've seen this episode or this depiction. And what are some things that you think of when you see this picture? What are some things you think of? Not complimentary to hunters. That is why I put this picture up here, so we can talk about that. So a lot of people have these stereotypes of hunters, and some of these are that hunters are uneducated. They're a little goofy, right? Hunters are dangerous or aggressive. This isn't the proper way to handle a firearm. So we get that imagery from things like shows or movies. Hunters don't have a respect for wildlife, and that hunters are only men. Fits our picture right here. So these are some common stereotypes that we hear a lot when we are talking to the public. And it's not anybody's fault that they have these stereotypes, because these stereotypes come almost directly from TV shows or movies or media or cartoons that we watch from when we're super, super young. So we grow up our whole life thinking that these things are true. But what Kelly and I are here to do today is to convince you that these stereotypes, well, sometimes these do apply a lot of times to poachers, and I always say poachers and hunters are different people. Sometimes these might apply to poachers when that they don't have a respect for wildlife, or they might be uneducated. These are not true when we're talking about hunters, and hopefully we can explain that to you here today. The first thing that I do want to point out is that hunting is a very safe sport or hobby. And this was a study that was done a few years ago. And it pulled out all of our sports or activities that a lot of people will participate in. And on the blue side here, on the left side here, are the safest activities. And the highlighted one there is hunting with firearms. And the only activity in this study that was safer than that was playing pool. Hunting is actually safer than bowling. It's safer than tennis. It's safer than mountain biking, which seems like a pretty sometimes dangerous thing. It's even safer than golf. Whereas on the right here in the green side, as you could probably imagine, the least safe sport is football. Not a super shocker there, but we also have things like riding bicycles are dangerous, cheerleading dangerous, a lot of those different dangerous activities. And in fact, if you play tackle football, you are 149 times more likely to be injured than if you went hunting. So this study alone, I think, shows how safe hunting actually is. It's just this perception that when we include things like bows and arrows or firearms in a sport, it can get dangerous. And then it's very true. And we are the first ones that will acknowledge that that can turn very dangerous. But all of our hunters here in Ohio, they have to go through a certification where they learn how to handle those things. They have to go through a hunter education course, and that teaches them how responsible to be. And because we get that education, we get them taught about how much they need to respect the implements they're holding, the people around them, the wildlife, it turns out to actually be pretty safe. All right, so these are some pictures of my mom and I, Kelly and I, over the years, as well as my dad and my brother here. And we, like I said, we are here to hopefully convince you otherwise of these stereotypes if you have held them in the past. So Kelly and I are both hunters. I have been hunting my entire life. Our family, the only protein that we eat, for the most part, aside from every now and then when we have chicken, is all from wild game. So our fish is harvested walleye. This is what we did for Christmas this past year. Since the Santa hats, we are constantly eating duck and geese, pheasant, venison, turkey, dove. We are very respectful of all of the things we eat. And we take great pride in that we harvest it in the field, we bring it home, and we process it all ourselves. So that in itself has earned us a huge respect for what we are eating, and we have a major respect for wildlife. Every year we have great stories that we bring home and we can share, and we learn something every year about wildlife. So hopefully as we give you this presentation, our goal here today is to convince you that hunters are very respectful of what they do, we're educated about what we do, we're safe about what we do, and also, since we're both here today, hunting is not only for men. Women do it too, so it's very popular, and it's actually one of the more popular things growing in the hunting community is that women are taking more of an interest.
And I just want to jump in 1 minute. So I myself, until I met Jim there next to me, I did not hunt until I was an adult, never fired a gun until I was 21 years old. So for me to embrace this, I mean, this directly came from my husband and his background and his passion. For me to embrace this when we met, I was fascinated. And at first, admittedly reserved. There were some things I was very nervous about. But practice and continued effort in the field really makes it just second nature for all of us. And so then it was very naturalist for us to bring our kids up in this environment. And they themselves, now that once they were adults and able to hunt on their own, they now have a great comprehension of what it is to be a part of a very ethical, safe family hunting experiences. And they've shared that with a lot of their friends as well, which couldn't make a parent more proud. So that's all I wanted to say.
All right, so now that we kind of established that it's not necessarily a hunting versus conservation, it's a hunting is conservation, let's go ahead and take a look at the wildlife over time, which is probably one of my favorite portions of this presentation. And I love to talk about this topic because we've come a very long way. I often describe it as the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we started off pretty ugly, and we've gotten to a good place today. All right, so in 1803, when Ohio became a state, this is relatively kind of what Ohio looked like, a cartoon map of Ohio, so to speak. We have some of our major roads on the map already, but we have a lot of things on this map that we don't have here today. One of those is the Great Black Swamp, which we are on the, I would say, the eastern fringe of that here today. But the Great Black Swamp is that dark green area up there. It was about 1,500 square miles of wetlands, which is about the size of the state of Delaware, if you need some context for that. But this area was not what we think of wetlands today. We often think of a marsh habitat when we think of wetlands today. This was a forested wetland or a bottomland wetland. So if you think of what you would picture wetlands in Florida or Louisiana, where there's a lot of old growth trees and that wet habitat, that is kind of what our Great Black Swamp looked like back then. So a forested wetland, very important for a lot of resources, especially our waterfowl. They thrived in this area, and it's also a reason why they thrive here today. And I have lots of great stories about the Great Black Swamp. It's taken a very interest in me, and it's a really neat part of our history here in Ohio. And there are some awesome accounts of settlers when we started arriving here in Ohio, and it was actually the last place in the state to be developed. So today, it's a very developed area. We have a lot of agriculture going on. We have Toledo, Bowling Green. We have a lot of larger cities in that area. But this was actually the last place in Ohio that was settled, that was, had a lot of people in it. And that is because it was a miserable place to live. There are a lot of settlers who are describing firsthand accounts on how terrible it was. They talk about the mosquitoes and the diseases that they would get from mosquitoes. A lot of people describe this as a living hell. It was terrible. Nobody went here. In fact, if you were trying to go to Michigan, a lot of people would detour south below the swamp and then circle back around because it wasn't worth trying to go through the swamp. One of my favorite facts about the swamp is that you couldn't take a horse and buggy through the swamp. You had to have a team of ox. Horse weren't strong enough to make it through the swamp. And when they traveled through the swamp with their ox team, and often people were leading the ox through the muck and mud themselves, so the people were walking, and you had your family of 10 children, they were traveling a whopping 1 mile per day. That's all they made it. So it was a very slow trek if you decided to go through the swamp, 1 mile per day. And consequently, on every 1 mile, because Americans really like to capitalize on that business opportunity, they were setting up taverns, or bed and breakfasts, so you will. Because at the end of the day, when you were super tired, all you wanted was somewhere to sleep and something to eat. And why not set up a bed and breakfast every mile, because that was how far you could travel. And those prices, as you can imagine, were very, very high. So you had to pay a pretty penny, since that was the only option that you had. So the Great Black Swamp was our last place settled here in Ohio. But we also had some different animals here in the state that you might notice on this map. We had things like elk that we don't have here today. We had the passenger pigeon back then, which also has some amazing settler accounts. If you don't know the story of the passenger pigeon, it is a tale that I always tell when we're talking about hunting, because it truly shows the bad side of hunting and what can happen if we don't respect our wildlife species. And it's something very important, because we need to learn from that. So the passenger pigeon is like a dove, if you haven't heard of it before, just like kind of a bigger, slightly bigger version of our mourning doves. They were a migratory species, so they roosted in trees and they fluctuated throughout the country. And there were so many of them that there are firsthand accounts that when the passenger pigeons decided to migrate, they would take flight, they would leave the roosted trees, and there were so many that at noon, at the brightest point in the day, they would block out the sun. And they described it as eclipse. And raise your hand if you saw the eclipse this year. It's pretty awesome, yep. So a lot of people, and when they're talking about these passenger pigeons, they actually use an eclipse to describe it, because that experience that you had this year was the experience these settlers were getting back in the 1800s, but it wasn't because the moon blocked out the sun. It was because birds blocked out the sun. And we had billions and billions of them in one flock. There are also accounts of when they would roost in trees, they would poop so much on the trees, and there would be so much weight from the birds that they would actually snap limbs off of the trees, because there were so many. So we had a huge amount of these passenger pigeons, and these passenger pigeons were an awesome source of protein for the settlers that were coming through here, for the Native Americans that lived here. They were an easy source of protein, because when you think of a dove, we often associate dove with peace. That is what we associate that bird with. We don't associate a dove with strength and muscles and all this power, because they're a pretty weak animal, which is why we kind of associate them with peace. They're on the softer side of that temperament. Consequently, they don't have a super strong will to live, so they're fairly easy to harvest, just like their cousins, the passenger pigeons. Those are easy birds to harvest, especially with such billions in one flock, that people would use them as an important source of protein, and they would also sell them to make a living. So these birds were very important to the Native Americans and the settlers that were coming here. We also had mountain lions, or cougars. Contrary to maybe some things you might see on Facebook, we're hearing from some people, we don't have mountain lions here in Ohio anymore, but we did a couple hundred years ago. And we also used to have wolves. Of course, we don't have wolves here in Ohio anymore. Also, an important note was back then, 95% of Ohio was covered with trees. So we had a very forested area that obviously has changed today. So we fast forward about 100 years and things look a lot different. First and foremost, that forest is gone, but also the Great Black Swamp is drained. So obviously this area is no longer a swamp. So we have these fantastic cornfields and bean fields and specialty crops, because when you have a wetland, you have a very organic compound in that soil, which makes for great farming. When people realized this, they decided that this was a great opportunity to farm that area. It had a lot of nutrients. So the Great Black Swamp is drained, and I also like to continue my story here. We think back about traveling 1 mile through the Great Black Swamp. Obviously, today we can travel much further through that area than 1 mile a day, but I also always often refer back to those bed and breakfasts or the taverns that were there every 1 mile. And when we drain the swamp and we're going through, we're blowing past all of these businesses, right? They don't need the settlers' businesses anymore who are moving out west. So they're going out of business. They're losing a lot of profit. And what do those really forward-thinking businessmen think? Well, they have 10 kids, and those 10 kids are really good at hauling buckets of water. So they would actually send their children down to the creek or the stream or the river nearby, and they would wet down and make a big mud pit on the road that people were still traveling via horse and buggy or ox. Make a giant mud pit so that when they came by their bed and breakfast, they actually got stuck. And this is a very funny, awesome part of history, but it also shows how amazing wetlands are, because a component of wetlands is that hydric soil, meaning the soil that holds water very well. So when their 10 kids threw pails of water on it, it stayed mucky. And if you look at this area today, it still holds water very well. And that is the history of the Great Black Swamp. So they would get stuck, and of course, those owners of the bed and breakfasts or the taverns, they would help them get out, but it wasn't free. So they would charge them to get out, they would charge them for a meal and for a night of stay, and that was how they kind of stayed in business for a while. So always a fun little story kind of about the history of our region. Some new creatures arrived here in the 1900s. We have red fox. Coyotes also appear. Coyotes I think of as the replacement for the wolves. We haven't always had coyotes in the state, nor have we always not had red fox. Red fox and coyotes are actually native to the western states. They like areas like California, Arizona, New Mexico, desert habitats. Well, when we wiped off all of our trees and we started planting cornfields, I always tell the little kids that a harvested cornfield looks a lot like a desert, very open, no trees. And so these red fox and the coyotes, they really liked that. So they started moving east and started inhabiting our state. And then we also had the introduction of carp. So carp are not a native species here to the country. They actually cause a lot of problems for our wetlands and our aquatic areas. But they were brought here because we had done such a bad job at taking care of our fish and wildlife resources that they needed a fish to provide them with food. And a carp can live in the poorest of conditions. So they brought carp over as a food resource and thought it was going to be great. A lot of times when we think we have great ideas, they turn out not to be so great. And this was one of them. So carp started appearing. They are brought over from Europe and Asia. And then we also have only 10% of our original forests are left, and that is mostly in southern and eastern Ohio. We also had the extinction of the passenger pigeon. So think back to that story where there were so many that they would cause an eclipse, where they would break branches off of trees. And a lot of settlers write that it would be impossible to exhaust this resource. There's just so many that the human mind couldn't fathom them ever going into extinction. But the last passenger pigeon actually died in the Cincinnati Zoo. Her name was Martha. She was the last passenger pigeon in the world. She died in 1914 right here in Ohio. And that is the telltale story of what can happen if we don't have hunting regulations, if we don't respect our wildlife. It can be what we call the bad side of hunting, or the ugly side of hunting, because they were overhunted, and then coupled with the habitat loss, they no longer have their roosting trees. They decimated that population. So something that back then people couldn't imagine a world without them. It would be like to you, we couldn't imagine a world where we weren't bothered by Canada geese, right? There's no possible way that could ever happen, but it did. And so it's something that we always take as a humbling reminder when we talk about conservation. We also had the extirpation of a lot of species. Extirpation, if you haven't heard that word before, basically means they go extinct from an area. So right now we're talking about Ohio, so it means that they were no longer living in Ohio. So starting from the earliest ones to go extirpated to the latest, bison used to live here in Ohio. They were extirpated in 1803. We had elk, wolf, mountain lion, bobcat, black bear, snowshoe hare, which a lot of people don't know that we actually had here in Ohio, river otter, white-tailed deer, and wild turkey all go extirpated. So by 1909, you can no longer find any of these animals here in the state. Obviously, a lot of those animals are here today, so we'll talk about how they come back. So we fast forward another 200 years in 2003, what we kind of call current day. This is what Ohio looks like. We have a lot of interstates on there. We have our capital city. We have a lot of different lakes pop up because we're actually creating reservoirs on a lot of our rivers as a water resource. So a lot of things happen. The river otters come back. We're going to talk about how they were actually brought back here today. Same with the black bear. We didn't actually bring the black bear back. We didn't intentionally bring them back. They're just a proof, them as well as the bobcats, are a proof of what happens if we treat our environment well, if we conserve our environment. We'll bring these guys back. Because at this point, we have a lot more forest in Ohio, which is what black bear and bobcat really enjoy. And we just put the habitat there. Kind of, if you feed them, they will come. And they came back from Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky. We also have deer and turkey come back. We'll talk about how they were reintroduced to the state as well. 30% of Ohio is trees now, so not as good as that 95 when we started, but we are constantly growing this number in our proper forest management practices. Reintroduction, we're going to hit on these guys, but deer, wild turkey, and river otter are reintroduced, along with a lot of other species coming back on their own. And we're going to kind of look at some key moments in conservation before we get to talking about those species that were reintroduced. So these are key moments, key good moments that got us from that 1903 map to current day. How did we go from being so poor in our resources to being in a good place? And so some of these things that happened, the first thing actually happened very, very early on. In 1829, we passed our very first law here in Ohio to protect wildlife. And I always love to ask this question. What law do you think we passed? It was to protect one species. What do you think that species was in 1829? Fish? Good guess, not quite. A lot of kids will jump on and say deer or turkey, because those are the things they see the most. It's actually this little guy. This is a muskrat. So the very first law that we passed was to protect muskrats, and it prohibited the trapping of muskrats during their breeding season. And it seems like a very random species to protect, but when you think about 1829, this is how they were making their clothes. So their clothes were coming from muskrat, beaver, river otter. Muskrat was very plentiful resource. Their fur was of very good quality to make their clothing and to also trade with Europeans on the other side of the world, the French, to get the resources like gunpowder that they needed to survive here in the wild Americas. And so muskrats were being overtrapped, and we started to realize this. So we put a prohibition on trapping during their breeding season to offer them a chance to replenish the things that were trapped during the fall and winter, which is also characteristic of when their pelts are in the best shape. So this made sense from the wildlife standpoint and also the trapping standpoint. So that was our very first law. We fast forward a few decades and we passed our first law to protect fish. So now we're protecting our fish because that's a very important resource. And unfortunately, by 1857, a lot of our fish populations have been over-harvested, or the amount of sediment that has entered the streams have caused a population decline. And also in 1857, we passed our first non-game law. So before this, we were protecting fish, we were protecting muskrats, things that we're harvesting to benefit those settlers and the Native Americans that are here. But now, already early as 1857, is the settler mindset thinking, it's not only important to protect the things that are benefiting us, the deer, the turkey, the muskrat, the way that we're getting our food and our clothes, but it's also important that we are protecting the things that we're not harvesting. And that is a very forward-thinking mindset for somebody in 1857. Because in 1857, all you cared about was how you were going to survive tomorrow. It was a very hard way of living. But already we have this forward-thinking mindset of we need to protect songbirds because maybe they don't completely understand the importance that they have, but they're already acknowledging that they have an importance in the environment and we need to protect those. Fast forward a little bit, 1873, the Ohio Fish Commission established. This is the predecessor of the Ohio Division of Wildlife. So we go through some name changes over the decades, but we were first established, as I mentioned earlier, as the Ohio Fish Commission. In 1886, the first game wardens are hired. So we only had a handful in the 1800s, but today we have one in every county. So we have 88 county officers. We also have undercover investigators. We have some extra officers, some wildlife officer supervisors. So when you total up all of those numbers, we have well over 100 commissioned officers that are in charge of protecting the wildlife, that are in charge of enforcing these laws that we're going to talk about. By 1888, 2 years later, we have one officer in every county. So very quickly is this wheel starting to spin as far as what we can do for protection. In 1900, the Lacey Act is passed. This is very critical for this time period because this is very important. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, people are not only hunting and fishing and trapping for themselves, for their families to eat and have clothes, they are also hunting and fishing to sell things. And in Ohio, you can no longer sell wild game. People can sell perch and walleye. Some people can sell venison. You have to have a special license to do that. The average hunter like us, we can't sell venison, the venison that we harvest. But earlier you could, and this was what we called market hunting. And this was a huge reason that a lot of our resources started to decline. And the Lacey Act prohibited the sale of anything that was harvested illegally. So we're starting to get some of those laws put in place. It's not the complete end to market hunting, hunting, but it is the beginning of an end, which is really helping our wildlife populations. So the Lacey Act is still something that is enforced today, and it is enforced a lot with black market sale of wild game. So our wildlife officers are still enforcing this Lacey Act. In 1913, it is a requirement that all residents have a hunting license. So think back to where we get our funding. We were founded in 1873, but it isn't really until in 1913 that we get a steady source of funding coming in. So with this steady source of funding, we are able to do more things. In 1918, we're now required to have a trapping license, so another source of funding to do that important conservation work. And also very important is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is established. So at this point, we're really recognizing that it's important to conserve our migratory birds here in Ohio, but we also recognize that those migratory birds are going into Canada and they're going into South America and Mexico and Central America. So it's important that we are conserving them all across the different continents that they are crossing. In 1920, we purchased our first wildlife area using solely the hunting license money over the past 7 years. So this is the beginning of showing how our hunters are paying for that conservation. They're buying that hunting license, and that hunting license is buying public land that we can all enjoy. So the first wildlife area was called Roosevelt Game Preserve. It's now part of Shawnee State Forest. But the game preserve was meant to protect the wildlife on there, but it was also meant to raise more wildlife and reintroduce it to the state. So I did a lot of research on Roosevelt Game Preserve. Very interesting component, because a lot of people in the 20s, they referred to the game preserve as the zoo. So instead of going to the Columbus Zoo and seeing elephants and giraffes and lions and pandas and all of these things that we don't have the opportunity to see here in Ohio, people were visiting Roosevelt Game Preserve and calling it the zoo to see deer and turkeys and raccoons and black bears. All of these things that we have here in Ohio now today, but very few of us, I think, would be excited to go to a zoo, and the highlight of the zoo is seeing a raccoon. We are very excited to see all these exotic animals, but these people are going because they had never seen a raccoon before, because the populations were so low that they didn't have that opportunity. And so thanks to the hunting license money that was able to buy this game preserve, they were able to reintroduce a lot of our species. In 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Act is passed. So as we talked about before, this is an extra tax on hunting equipment, and all of that is earmarked for conservation. So it goes to the federal government, and the federal government redistributes it to the states based on a variety of different factors, but it's a very important resource for all of these state wildlife agencies that are starting to appear. In 1941, the official ODNR is established, and it looks just like it does, almost like it does today. We've gone through a little bit of the name changes with the different divisions since then, but this is kind of the modern day ODNR, what it looks like today. In 1950, the Dingell-Johnson Act is passed, so extra tax on that fishing equipment. And then we finally end in 1973 with the National and Ohio Endangered Species Act being passed. So now we are protecting those animals that are on the brink of extinction. There are a lot of different other important things in between all these lines and further past 1973, but these are kind of the highlights throughout history that really got us here today. So when we are talking about that timeline and we were looking back at those maps and we think back to why did our wildlife populations decline between 1803 and 1903? How do we go from such a good situation to such a bad situation? We talked about how we got to where we are today, but why did this happen? Does anybody have any guesses for that? I hinted a little bit. Yeah, loss of habitat is a big one, and that is actually the biggest, continues to be the biggest driving force that our wildlife populations decline today is habitat loss. So that is the biggest one. Anybody else? Yeah, no regulations. We have overhunting and overtrapping and overfishing. So that was a big one. We think about the passenger pigeon story, how that affects our wildlife. So we have habitat loss, overhunting, and then the other one is also pollution. So especially kind of thinking a little bit more further into the 1900s, we get pollution becomes a bigger factor into affecting our wildlife. But in these early days, we still do have a lot of more pollution because we're bringing in a lot more people to the state. So those factors are the three biggest factors that are driving those population declines. And I say that because a lot of people maybe have seen this picture before. This is a bison skull pile. This is out west. This is not something that's really happening in Ohio, although the bison were over-harvested here in Ohio, but this is very characteristic of the Great Plains. And this is what I use to show the bad side of hunting. And unfortunately, somebody who's uneducated about hunting today thinks of this picture. They think of the piles of bison that were over-harvested and not utilized correctly. And I always kind of point, and I want to stress out that this is illegal, unethical, and unregulated. At this point in time, they hadn't had the requirements that they have for hunting regulations. And this is what happens if we don't have the respectful, the mindful people behind the things that we are doing here today. On the flip side of that is we have the good side of hunting. This is me and my dad on the opening day of teal season a few years ago. This is the good side. This is the legal, the ethical, the regulated hunting. I believe we're holding 8 teal in that picture. The limit of teal per person per day is 6. So we didn't even harvest our legal limit for that day. But there is a legal limit, and that's different from that bison picture. There was no limit back then. There is a legal limit here today, and that is what makes hunting very good today. So getting into kind of some of those benefits is a great lead in to the benefits of hunting and fishing, knowing the difference between the good and the bad, and then showing how the good is providing something towards conservation here today. So when we think about what are some benefits of hunting, I have a lot in mind, but I don't know if you guys have any in mind that you've had before you came in, or if there's any that maybe have popped into your mind as we've gone through just the little bit that we've done today. Does anybody have anything that they might think is something that hunting does that is good? Yeah, okay, so a wildlife management tool, that is one. So it can reduce, if we get too high of a population, it can bring that down to a healthy level. Anybody else think of anything? It's all right, you're gonna learn it all. So we have lots of different things. Wildlife, or hunting creates wildlife habitat. We looked at that in that timeline where there was a direct correspondence between hunting license being a requirement, and then we were able to use that money to purchase our first wildlife area. So it creates wildlife habitat, preserves that wildlife habitat. It's a healthy food source. So we eat solely wild game. There's many other people across the nation that are relying on hunting to provide their food source. It's a local food source. It's very organic. There's nothing says quite like knowing where your food comes from between seeing it on the hoof and seeing it to your table. So it's a very healthy food source. Along with that is hunting is also utilized for food donations. So we have hunters here in Ohio and across the nation that harvest the deer that they harvest, or if they go out to harvest another deer that maybe they aren't going to utilize, they donate it to the food pantry. And that provides hundreds of thousands of meals for people who are in unfortunate situations. So it can help out our community a lot. It's a wildlife management tool, kind of as we talked about. We'll get into some more specifics with that. It gets people out in nature. So like I said in the beginning, whatever gets you outside is what we're here to do today. We really want to get you passionate about what's outside. But for some people, hunting and fishing, that's what gets them outside. And that also attributes to their mental health. So there's a direct correspondence between getting outside in nature and having a clearer mind and better mental health. And for a lot of people, this gets them outside, and this is helping their lifestyle. It creates a huge economic impact that we'll talk about in a little bit. There's a scientific contribution to this as well. We'll hint on that a little bit more. But because we have hunters that are out there seeing the resource, embedding themselves in the resource, they're able to contribute to the science behind the wildlife that we have here today. It allows for reintroducing species that we're going to hit on. And then it also funds our conservation, which is kind of how I kicked off this presentation. So the way that we are funding conservation is through those Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts. I said I would keep hitting on them. And since their inception, since the Pittman-Robertson inception in 1939, it has raised $16.8 billion for wildlife conservation across America. And that does not count for inflation. So that is just, when it was in 1939, that doesn't account for inflation here today. So that number in our minds is actually much, much higher. The Dingell-Johnson Act has attributed to $11.8 billion since its inception in 1952. And these numbers are only going to continue to rise over time. This here is a pie chart showing the revenue of the Division of Wildlife, so where we get our funding. This is a breakdown of last year, how we got our funding. The bright orange, 34% of that came from these acts, from the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. If you can't read that number, it says it's almost $28.5 million came to the Ohio Division of Wildlife from these acts. That's our main source of funding last year. Just below that, 22% of our funding came from the sale of fishing licenses, about $19 million. Below that is 15% from hunting license, $12.7 million. And then the biggest one below that is 14% from the sale of deer permits. So if you are hunting a deer in Ohio, you have to have a hunting license. You also have to have a deer tag or a deer permit. There's an extra fee with that deer permit. So that is a big contributor for our funding as well, with just a little over $12 million. So you see that almost 3/4 of this, of our funding, came from funding from somebody going out and hunting or fishing here in Ohio. All these other tiny little graphs are just other sources of revenue. Maybe they're the sale of our legacy stamp, the sale of our license stamp. But the smallest one here, the 3% are general revenue funds. It's that one of those blue ones in there. So that is just to show how minimal capital bond dollars we get. So keep in mind this pie chart kind of as we talk through the rest of our presentation. So the economic impact here in Ohio, the Ohio Division of Wildlife just recently put out a study, looked at the year 2022 and how many hunters and fishers we had here in Ohio, as well as how many people participated in target shooting and participated in wildlife watching. And we wanted to know the economic impact that these people had. So anglers or fishers had the most contribution towards our economy with $5.5 billion. So that includes them buying their fishing license to support us, but that also is, did they book a charter here on Lake Erie? Did they contribute to the sale when they bought their fishing lures? They contributed to the sale of our economy through that way. Same with the rest of these. So target shooters spent $2.6 billion. Hunters spent $1.9 billion, and wildlife watchers spent $1.6 billion, all attributing to a total of $11.6 billion attributed to our economy here in Ohio just in 1 year through people enjoying wildlife. And those numbers also contributed to a lot of jobs. Fishing, not surprisingly, has the most jobs supported with Lake Erie here and all the charter captains that are employed via that, so 34,000 jobs because of anglers. 22,000 jobs because of target shooters, 11,000 jobs because of hunters, and 11,500 jobs because of wildlife watchers. Almost 80,000 jobs just from wildlife enjoyment here in Ohio. Now we talk about the wildlife management tool, which is a little bit difficult to talk about than just showing some numbers and understanding those numbers. One of the biggest examples that I use for how hunting is conservation for wildlife is by showing how it's a wildlife management tool for overpopulation. So we think back to that map. We used to have mountain lions. We used to have wolves here in Ohio. We also had deer here in Ohio during the same time of that. We no longer have those mountain lions and those wolves. Back then, those were the biggest predators of deer. They were keeping those populations in check, so to speak. Because of the way that the state has gone through developments, because we have more cornfields and we do forest, our habitat is not suitable for mountain lions and wolves anymore. So we don't have a large predator in check for the deer population. I always tell people that the biggest predator of a deer here in Ohio is a car. It's not an animal, it's not a person, it's a car. The most of our deer die here in Ohio because of car accidents. The second most is through hunting. So if we didn't have hunters, we'd have a lot more car accidents, but we would also have a higher population and a very unhealthy population of deer. And we also have, coyotes will eat young deer, bobcats will eat young deer, but we don't have one single predator or a small group of predators that are able, there's not enough of them to keep the deer population in check. We rely solely on hunters for that. Our hunters are replacing the mountain lions and the wolves. So when we talk about overpopulation, if we don't have an area that allows hunting or it's in the city limits and you can't have safe hunting happen in that area, we often see an overpopulation of deer. And you may have seen this before. It's what we call a browse line. So this cartoon is showing that deer are only so tall, they can only reach so high, and they will eat off the vegetation of the trees and the plants that grow below. And what this looks like in real life is a situation like this. So once you know that browse line exists, the next time you drive through the cornfields in Ohio, look at the tree lines and the woodlots, and you will see these browse lines. They might not be as prevalent as this one. This is clearly a very bad overpopulation of deer, but you will see that the deer have eaten all of the green, especially at this time of year where they can reach. This is not good for our flora life. It is very harmful for a lot of our specific flora species, especially our wildflowers, that some of them are going towards endangerment. So it can put a huge decline on our biodiversity from a flora standpoint in the area, and then also affect the fauna that can live in that area. So you can see from the roadsides, look at the woodlots surrounded by cornfields, and you'll see these browse lines, and you know that that area is overpopulated with deer. And from the inside of the forest, if you're walking through a forest or taking a hike, and you notice that you can see very far at eye level through the forest, and you don't see a lot of plants on the forest floor, and you see that a lot of the leaves have been eaten off the younger trees, this is what a browse line looks from inside that forest. We do have mature old growth forests here in Ohio. Some of these areas might look similar to this picture, but that's when you have characteristically really large trees. On this picture, you can see a lot of these trees are very small, and they should have leaves hanging lower to the ground, but they don't because the deer are eating them all. So by hunting, we're able to control this overpopulation in those areas so that hopefully we don't have situations like this. And if we do have situations like this, we can implement some measures with controlled hunting, especially in some of our restricted areas. We can implement controlled hunting in, say, a metro park or something like that at a safe, regulated level. And it's hopefully removing those deer from that population so that the flora can survive and the fauna that relies on that flora can thrive as well. Also, I always like to stress that we always try to get hunters in those areas to remove those deer as that wildlife management tool, rather than any wildlife professionals going in and taking those deer out themselves. Because you're giving an opportunity to the average, everyday person, everyday hunter to go in and harvest those deer themselves the way that they know how, and you're giving them a meal opportunity. Not saying that if professionals go in and harvest those deer, oftentimes they are getting donated to a food pantry if they can be, but it's all about getting those people out there, having them help partake in the conservation of our wildlife species. Another way of the wildlife management tool that I kind of hit on before is the data collection. So this is just one example, probably our biggest example that we have at the Division of Wildlife of how hunters are benefiting towards the scientific contribution is through our Ohio Bow Hunter Survey. This started in 1990. It's a purely volunteer basis. So not every hunter that goes out has to complete this, but our people who are very passionate about helping our wildlife species will do this. And this specifically tracks the information on our fur bearer species. So these three graphs here are showing raccoon, coyote, possum, skunk, red fox, and gray fox. And this is all data gathered from hunters sitting in the woods waiting to harvest a deer. They're keeping track of how many of these species they see and reporting it back to us. And this is a huge, huge resource for us because we can't be out there sitting all day long trying to count species. But when you have a large swath of hunters going out into the landscape, they're able to gather this information for us. So this kind of shows raccoon over time has had an increase. Coyotes have had a large increase. Possums have had a slight decrease, but relatively stable along with skunk. Red fox have had a decrease, but I think we're on the more upswing of that as well. Gray fox has also had a dramatic increase or decrease. And because we are able to gather this data, knowing that gray fox have had a dramatic decrease especially, because it's provided by hunters, we are able to implement efforts that we're currently doing with like Ohio State and other agencies or other universities to try to help those species. So this is a direct correlation from because of what the hunters saw while they were out there, we're able to monitor those species and make changes so that they can benefit in the future. Species reintroduction. So this is from the Safari Conservation International, and these are some highlights of species that because we have hunters on the landscape, these species were able to be reintroduced or their population bolstered. Specifically, what we're going to look at here is the top two, white-tailed deer and wild turkey. Those are the ones that really apply here in Ohio. Also the ducks and waterfowl there towards the bottom. But in the 1900s, there were about 500,000 deer in the country. Today, there are well over 32 million, and that is a direct correspondence to hunters. With turkey, we had about 100,000 in the country. Today, we have over 7 million. So these species, bighorn sheep, elk, black bear, antelope, other things that don't exist here in the States, rhinos and buffaloes, those species are thriving in their capacity because of hunters. And it's a very difficult concept for people to grasp with the rhinos. It's even for me, it's a hard concept to grasp on how hunters are benefiting the rhinos as a fellow hunter. But when we're thinking about what's happening over there in Africa with the rhinos, is that hunting and poaching are different things. And what they have going on in Africa is poaching. Because of what they have, because of their government, their situations, they don't have the resources that we have here in America to enforce, to punish those poachers. They do when they can. But what they have, because of hunters, because of people who are ethical and want this opportunity to harvest a rhino, is that they have people who are willing to pay to do this, support their local economy, and that is a driving force for them to protect and to punish the poachers. If we didn't have the legal hunters, they would be outcompeted by those poachers. So it's a very difficult concept. It's something that happens on a smaller scale, but by harvesting these rhinos in an ethical way, those are actually pushing the poachers out. With the way that a lot of the African species also work is the rhinos will actually kill other rhinos. So if hunters can go over there and harvest an older rhino that doesn't have the breeding capacity that it should, that is as much as a younger rhino, that older rhino might actually go out and kill a fellow younger rhino that has a better potential of breeding. So by harvesting this older rhino, we're removing it from the equation, we're saving a younger rhino for better breeding. It's a very complex way of thinking, but over time we have shown that throughout the past 100 years, we are able to help these populations. Just remember that when we are talking about species, modern day species being driven into endangerment, and if it has to do with harvesting, it's poaching. It's not hunting. Poaching and hunting are not the same thing. All right, so we're looking at here in Ohio, focusing back on what's happening locally is, as we talked about, the deer was extirpated in 1909, reintroduced here in the 1920s and 30s. Driving force was that Roosevelt Game Preserve where these deer were bred and released into the wild. In 1943, we had our first hunting season in Adams, Pike, and Scioto counties. We harvested 164 bucks. This is the very first buck. Picture of the very first buck that was harvested in the modern day season. So it was harvested, one of those bucks was the 164 that was harvested in 1943. So after just a couple decades of work, this shows how well the deer population took off after just a couple decades of work. If we were able to reintroduce this species and turn around and harvest it in about 20 to 30 years, that shows that this is really successful. And we know today that it's extremely successful. Some places it's been too successful. We have too many deer. But we had our first statewide hunting season in 1956, and then today, in our most recent deer season, we are harvesting over 200,000 deer on a regular basis now. So we've come a long way in about 100 years, but because we have hunters, because we have those people purchasing those hunting licenses and those deer permits, we were able to reintroduce these animals. That is the reason that we had to do that, because money isn't everything, but it sure drives a lot of things. And if we didn't have the funding to do this, we wouldn't have been able to do that. With wild turkey, a similar story, extirpated in 1909, reintroduced in 1956. But this is a continued effort. Up until here recently, we were actually relocating turkeys throughout the state into the early 2000s. So that upper picture is a picture of one of our more early turkey releases. The colored picture is from the early 2000s. This is the first wild turkey release in Sandusky County. It's happening on Picker Creek Wildlife Area. And this picture is pretty special to us because the gentleman on the left of the turkey box is my dad, and this is my brother. So they were part of the first turkey relocation in Sandusky County. So it's a pretty special picture for us. In 1966, we had our first wild turkey season. Again, that money contributing towards the relocation across the state for these birds. It was open in 9 counties originally, and there were 12 birds harvested. This past spring, we harvested over 15,000 birds in the state. So because of the hunting license dollars that you have to purchase to harvest turkeys in Ohio, we were able to bring these species to a lot of different counties in the state. A river otter is another interesting one. Extirpated from the 1900s, reintroduced in the 80s. They were reintroduced mostly in eastern Ohio, in the Grand River, Killbuck, Little Muskingum River, and Stillwater Creek watersheds. So these animals have an interesting story. We went down to Louisiana and Arkansas. We trapped 123 river otters using foothold traps. So this trap here is the reason that we have river otters here today. This trap was used to trap river otters and bring them back here to the state. These traps are also used in modern day trapping. This trap is outfitted with some extra things on it. It has rubber on the footholds. It has some extra springs to prevent the river otters from twisting too much. But this trap was used to bring river otters back. So trapping is the only reason that we have river otters here today, because if we didn't have this tool, if this tool was not legal to use in our country, we wouldn't have been able to bring them back. We now have a limited river otter trapping season since 2005. It's across the state here. It's very highly regulated because we don't have as high of a population of river otters as we do as, say, raccoons or other species that are trapped here in Ohio. But because of trappers, because of people who are passionate about bringing these animals back, is the reason that we have river otters. So when those 123 river otters were trapped in Louisiana and Arkansas, they were brought back, they were released, they did very well in eastern Ohio, and on their own, they slowly migrated through the rest of the state and repopulated our areas today. A lot of our wetland habitats or our rivers or our creeks have river otters. It's just, you have to know what you're looking for when you're trying to find one of those guys. So because of hunters and trappers, we now have deer, turkey, and river otters to enjoy. We also have Canada geese. They were actually extirpated from the state as well, brought back because of hunters, as well as a lot of other species here in Ohio as well. All right, so it's time for me to take a break from talking, and we'll get you kind of hearing a little bit about Magee Marsh Wildlife Area, the history of that area, and how you can enjoy it yourself.
I think it's great. She brought me along because she's like, Mama, I don't know if I can talk this long. So, you know, but she's only left me 20 minutes. So I'll zip through my slides. But before we just dive into some slides, I have a quick, I'm going to provide some comedy relief for you guys, I guess. If you feel the need to get up, stretch, do whatever you want to do, that's fine. I'm going to tell you a quick little story about our family. Sarah had a slide back there talking about hunting and providing as a healthy food resource for your family. And we have a great story. Sarah's heard it probably 100 times at bare minimum. So I was a stay-at-home mom. I quit with the Ohio Division of Wildlife to be a stay-at-home mom once my first son was born. And I'm going to say Jake was about 4. I was going on my first real weekend getaway with my girlfriends. This was first. Sarah was just a toddler. Jake was 4. So in my infinite wisdom, I thought, well, I'm going to make a quick dinner Friday night and, feed them. I was getting picked up by my girlfriend, and I was going to be gone. They would have leftovers. I made chicken, shake and bake chicken. So sat down to eat with my family, and we're eating the chicken, and Jake asks what we're eating. And I said, chicken. I didn't realize to this point how much our lifestyle had influenced our son. I said, chicken. And he looked at his dad, and he said, Dad, did you shoot the chicken? Jim said, I didn't shoot the chicken. He looked at me, he said, Mom, you shot the chicken. I said, no, I didn't shoot the chicken. He said, oh. He goes, well, who shot the chicken? And I said, the chicken came from the grocery store, Jake. And in 0.2 seconds, he said, oh, the man at the grocery store shot the chicken. So we really, at that point in time in my life, I realized that our children were really being raised differently from most other children. And I had to kind of modify, I guess, or teach them how the rest of the world eats. So it was kind of an interesting story at our dinner table one night. My section is really going to be about McGee Marsh Wildlife Area, and we're going to kind of pull away a little bit from the hunting, but I'm still going to pull you back into why hunting is important for McGee Marsh, and we're going to talk about what is special about McGee. So for those of you who don't know or have never been to McGee, that big red star up there in the corner is where McGee is located. It's about a half an hour west of here, right on Route 2. It's about 2,000 acres of wetland habitat, and it is part of a 12,000 acre complex right there on the shores of Lake Erie that is all wetland habitat. And believe it or not, that 12,000 acre complex, the majority of it at one time were hunting clubs. So we do have the hunting clubs to thank to preserve those properties. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that in some future slides. That land is made up of the state of Ohio doesn't own all of that 12,000 acres. It's made of actually a majority of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. And then also Lucas County Metro Parks manages Howard Marsh Metro Park. These two birds are just some cute photos. The bird on the left is a prothonotary warbler, and the bird on the right is a green heron. Those are both pictures that were taken on the boardwalk at McGee. So McGee Marsh, this is just an overview of McGee Marsh. You can see the marsh off in the background. In the foreground, you can see, if any of you are locals, ever heard of Crane Creek State Park, you can see the beach on the left-hand side. Crane Creek State Park, this was the location of Crane Creek State Park, and the majority, I don't want to say the majority, quite a few people still refer to McGee Marsh as Crane Creek. They want to know where Crane Creek is because they remember the beach. It was a swimming beach. We purchased it. We gave part of the wildlife area to Division of Parks for that swimming beach, but we absorbed it back in 2008 when they had sort of a budget crisis. But my question for all of you is, we're the most visited wildlife area in the state. We get about 100,000 people a year come through McGee Marsh. Why do we get them there? What brings these people? Warblers, right. That prothonotary warbler was a good clue, and so was my boardwalk picture. Absolutely. So those cars were taken during the beginning of May. We make good use of those parking lots that were once built by Crane Creek State Park, and they're now used very heavily in the spring for warbler migration. This is just a sample of the birds that you would see if you came out sometime in the end of April. Certainly the first 2 weeks in May is probably the busiest time. The scarlet tanager is not a warbler, however, an absolute striking bird to see in the spring. I could go on and talk about the different species of warblers you would see. There are about 36 species of warblers that migrate through McGee Marsh. Sometimes we get an oddity. Sometimes some of them don't. So, but nonetheless, if you come in that first 2 weeks of May, albeit busy with people, you will have a phenomenal experience by seeing birds up close. I describe being on the boardwalk as sort of being in a zoo aviary without any enclosure. So McGee Marsh Wildlife Area, that 2,000 acres was, we'll talk a little bit here about the history, was once a hunting club. The majority of it now is wetlands, and the boardwalk area is still a wetland, but a different type of wetland. So where that blue line is, that is the outline of our boardwalk. It's about 3/4 of a mile, but it's in this habitat that is very, very rare along Lake Erie, and it's a forested beach ridge. So basically, it's nothing more than sand with some areas that hold water, and then trees. And so that forested beach ridge, when you start to think about that area, there's not a lot of habitat like that around. So this is what makes McGee Marsh really special and brings those birds through. We'll talk here a little bit more about why that's important. But that habitat, sorry, touch that. That habitat was getting basically smashed down once people realized that McGee Marsh was the place to be to see these birds. People were just coming out and walking through those trees and smashing down some really important fauna on the area. So in 1988, they built the boardwalk, and it was the first project that was funded from our Do Something Wild. So that is on your income tax, state income tax. It's a checkoff, and you can donate directly to the Division of Wildlife, and this was the first project funded by those funds in 1988. So here we're going to talk about why McGee Marsh is important to these birds. So I talked about that forested wetland, that forested beach ridge, and how important it is to these birds. When you stop and think about it, that bird right there is a black Hibernian warbler, really stunning bird, Sarah and my favorite. It only weighs actually less than the weight of 2 quarters, all right? That's it. But it travels in the winter. It's down there in the blue in the northern part of South America, travels all the way up through the States, and actually breeds in that orange area at the top all across Canada. This is the migration of many of the warblers that come through McGee. This is what their maps look like. Now, they're staying in different places in South America. Some of them don't go as far as South America. Some are just Central America. We have a few of them that do nest in Ohio, a few warblers that do nest, they're residents, but the vast majority of them are actually going up into Canada to nest. They're boreal forest nesters, so really deep woods. The length, they're really tiny, tiny birds, right? They're really small, just 4 inches. Again, they're really lightweight. But why Lake Erie? Why McGee Marsh? Why is that so important? So we look at where they wintered, right? That blue area where they wintered in South America. They are either island hopping across the ocean, or they're going around through Central America, and they're traveling north. And do you see all the Great Lakes up there? Basically, most of them are nesting on the north side. So those Great Lakes become a barrier to them. However, much of our Great Lakes has habitat that's not really friendly to birds. This is just a picture of the Cleveland shoreline. And if it's not a big city like Cleveland, even along our shoreline, think of Port Clinton's shoreline. Much of it is housing or development with very sharp edges. Like, right, we use those big giant rocks to keep Lake Erie in its place now. And it's not very friendly to birds. That habitat at McGee Marsh, that beach ridge, is really substantial because it warms up quickly and the insects start hatching early there. And the birds feed on those insects, gain the protein to then fly across Lake Erie. Sarah has a really cool story from this past spring. She was fishing out on Lake Erie with her dad and actually had a warbler on the boat for a long time with them fishing. It was eating all the midges on the boat. It was a foggy day. The bird got disoriented and basically just landed right on the boat with them. It was quite interesting.
We dropped it off at South Bass.
This is a phenomenal new technology tool that has come about, and eBird. So eBird is a site where birders can report the birds that they see, and through this data, they have developed some really cool graphics. So if you look over here where it says week of the year on the right-hand side, so that is the months right underneath there, January, February, March, April, and so on. That's the months. You can watch that bar move across. You can see, this is the magnolia warbler, which I didn't have a picture of, but the magnolia warbler winters in Central America. Watch what happens. You'll see it explode. Yep. In a very short period of time, all of those birds are going north all the way up into Canada, breeding, coming back. All right? And when you look at where Ohio is positioned, it's positioned right in the middle of that, right? So that's why, now, I don't want you to think that every warbler migrates to the McGee Marsh, because it doesn't happen. These birds are actually moving all across the Midwest. But you can see where Ohio is positioned. Like I said, it's kind of centrally located to that, and we do get a good number of birds migrating through. Now we're going to move to the history of McGee Marsh and how did we get to the point where we preserved McGee. Sarah talked pretty in depth about the Great Black Swamp earlier, so I'm not going to go there too much. What I do want you to understand is, yes, this red area was mostly flooded timber, but right along Lake Erie, it was deep water. So that was our coastal wetlands. There was about 300,000 acres of coastal wetlands from over like east of Sandusky from Vermilion all the way up to the Detroit area that rimmed Lake Erie right there. So that's a lot of acreage. In a very short period of time, from 1860 to 1900, we drained and cut all of the Great Black Swamp. Disappeared like that. And they didn't do it with chainsaws, right? They did it with crosscut saws, with hand saws, with horses, and hauled that wood out. Very arduous, very laborious, but they did it. And so it is amazing what the human mind can do. That's an example in the center there is one of the first ditch diggers in Northwest Ohio. So that's one of the tools that they created, steam run, to create ditches to start draining that water off. So this is just a smattering of what we have left. You can see McGee Marsh up there and that big 12,000 acre unit that I was talking about. To the west, we have another complex closer towards Toledo. But you can just see the smattering of these areas that are left that we have today. A lot of them are wetlands, some of them are upland habitat. Basically, McGee Marsh, the history of it is it was a hunting club. I said that many times. In 1903, John McGee, a single individual, purchased Crane Creek Shooting Club and Cleveland Hunting Club to effectively protect the land that we have as McGee. Now, John McGee didn't actually buy it to protect it. He bought it because he was an entrepreneur, and he was actually an inventor. He was also a banker. He was a lot of things. But he bought it because this was the last area along the lake to be drained and farmed. And that was the mentality back then. We drain land and we farm it for food. So that's what John McGee bought it for. He soon realized that he could not keep Lake Erie back. He didn't have the equipment to do that. And he realized how important hunting, these hunters by this time, would pay to hunt. So he started basically maintaining it as a hunting club, and that's what they kept going. The interesting part is that there's a picture of 5 over here on the right. There's 3 ladies in the middle. The middle lady is younger, but the 2 ladies on either side of her are John McGee's daughters, Ruth and Julia McGee. Those 2 ladies never married. John McGee passed away in 1925. They continued to manage McGee. They were also known as amazing muskrat trappers. Not so much that they trapped every muskrat on McGee. They fleshed and put them up, right, to be shipped for fur. So those 2 ladies were very hard-working ladies. They did sell it in 1940 to the McGee Marsh Hunt Club, and then the McGee Marsh Hunt Club folded, and in 1951, the Division of Wildlife purchased it, and it became the McGee Marsh Wildlife Area. We immediately started controlled hunts on the area. McGee Marsh still has controlled duck hunting today. We have always maintained it as a controlled duck hunt. McGee Marsh is considered a refuge, not an open public wildlife area. So much of McGee Marsh is closed to the public. There are a few public areas like the boardwalk. But yes, we did start hunting on it quite quickly, and we still do the hunts today. This is a picture of the visitor center. So in 1970, we could go back and talk a lot about the history of McGee, but I don't want to keep you here that long. There was a gentleman, his name was Carl Bednarik. He was sort of the first person to be the manager of McGee in the 50s. He started realizing very quickly that research and involvement, we needed that to bring back a lot of these wetland species. The Canada goose was his main focus. He's known sort of as the father of the Canada goose. If you want to blame somebody for bringing the Canada goose back to Ohio, it would be Carl. He also had the foresight to build what was called the Sportsman's Migratory Bird Center. That was a place where he could house his research staff, but also share with the public the important artifacts and relics that we had towards duck hunting and have people understand the importance of duck hunting for the area. We renovated the McGee Marsh Visitor Center in 2022, and it is full of really dynamic displays. They don't show up in pictures as well, but this display on the right is a 3D display. It's a diorama with mounted birds in it and animals. If you haven't been there, I really would welcome you to come out. We are open 10 to 4 Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and 10 to 3 Monday through Thursday till the end of October. So as far as coming out to visit McGee, a lot of people want to know when to come see the bald eagles. This is not the best time to come see bald eagles, right? They've left their nests. They've moved away from their nests. The best time to see bald eagles is when the leaves are off. So I always tell people, come out when it's cold. Just drive your car through, and you will see eagles, I promise. Definitely, they start breeding in February, and that's when you'll see them really close to the nests, for sure. There's 2 nests visible from our entrance road at McGee, both back by the boardwalk area. When you want to see waterfall, Sarah, you made them.
I'm sorry.
She changed my PowerPoint. She still has eagles up there. Coming to see waterfall at McGee is beautiful in the spring. These birds are coming back with their breeding plumage, and you want to get there as soon as the ice is out. Again, we have an entrance road. You can see a lot of these just from the entrance road. You don't have to stand outside and bear the bad weather, but it is a real special time of year to see a lot of different types of migrating waterfowl. So anytime, I would say in the month of March is the best month for waterfowl. Of course, the warblers, mid-April to late May, there's just really not a better time or place. We're continuously ranked about in the top 10 places in the country to come and see migrating songbirds. So next year, we have the biggest week in American birding. It is not something that the Division of Wildlife does. It is something that Black Swamp Bird Observatory puts on. They're a nonprofit group focused on songbird education and conservation. They organize this incredible 10-day festival that's full of talks and walks and anything related to it. They have a tattoo contest. They have sort of a showcase at Maumee Bay State Park with all kinds of vendors. That will go from May 9th to May 18th next year. So it's a little later than normal, but it's always from a Friday to the following Sunday. And it is really, truly a wonderful time. Even if you're not a birder, if you come out to see just the people is incredible, and the equipment they have. They were talking like $20,000 cameras they're walking around with, or lenses they're walking around with. You know, $3,000 for a pair of binoculars. Now, I have a $200 pair of binoculars, and I get to see the birds just as well as they do. But these are people who are serious about it, right? The cool thing about birding and being on the boardwalk, and Bridget got to experience this past spring, they will voluntarily tell you what kind of bird you're looking at, right? Like hunting and fishing, there's kind of some secrets involved in there. We don't want to give out, you know, all of our secrets because we want the take for ourselves, but that's not the case with birding. They're so excited to share their knowledge with you and what kind of birds they're seeing. And they'll be honest with you, like, I don't really know, you know, because the females can be hard to identify. But it's really a fantastic time to come out. Just understand it will be crowded with people as well as the birds. So this is our last slide that Sarah put together, and it's about what you can do for conservation. So the first thing is support hunting and fishing. You may not be an active hunter or fisherman, and you may never have any kind of will or want to do that in your life. But with what you learned today, you can at least support hunting and fishing and understand its importance to habitat on the ground. So have that conversation when you hear somebody talking negatively about a hunter. You know, have that conversation and say, hey man, I just learned about all that hunting brings to our landscape. And it's really important to support it because it's a constant battle to keep hunting and fishing going in the future. Contribute monetarily. So if you feel the need to contribute monetarily, there are a couple ways you can do that, several ways. But through the Division of Wildlife, we have our Ohio Wetland Stamp. An Ohio Wetland Stamp is required by a duck hunter to go out and hunt. It's a $15 wetland stamp. But this is a collectible stamp. We have an artist contest every year in which it is an artist painting, and it's judged on, chosen, and then that's going to be the stamp the following year. So it is a collectible stamp that you get in the mail if you would purchase one. We also have our license plates. This is our newest license plate. It is just for wetlands. So some of the revenue from the license plates would go towards wetlands. We also have deer, turkey, duck. We have a wood duck? We have a wood duck.
I don't know. We have a
bald
cardinal
eagle.
and a bald eagle.
Bald eagle, yep. Any one of those will go towards the Division of Wildlife. Reduce your impact, right? So think about what you're buying when you're at the grocery store. I know in the past few years, best example I can give, I've totally switched from using liquid detergent, which I used forever and a day, and now I'm using powdered detergent, right? Liquid detergent comes in a plastic bottle, not great for the environment. Yes, you can recycle it, but so little of it actually gets recycled. Now I buy powdered detergent, cardboard box, that can easily degrade in a landfill. So think about those things when you're at the grocery store or anywhere. Keep our places wild. How can we do that? You know, obviously, one thing you can do is just pick up litter when you see it. Safely pick up litter, right? That's really, really important. Don't just pick up any litter. Use a grabbing tool, use gloves. We don't recommend you're out there touching it, but it is nice to be able to. I know her boss actually, he goes on a walk every day around Findlay. He takes his bag and he takes his grabbers and he grabs anything he sees as he's walking. So that's one way you can do it. And I was supposed to say some other stuff. What was I supposed to say?
I have.
She'll fill you in.
That's
She's got
okay.
her little candid talk.
So litter is something that bothers me so much to my core. So when I talk about people to try to get them to understand the impact that litter has, I describe it as a triangle effect. It has 3 points of contact for how it's affecting our wild places. A lot of us think of the direct effect. The best way to describe this is the things that pop cans come in, the plastic. We've all seen a picture of that around a seagull or something. So litter is affecting or harming our wildlife on a direct impact. There is litter, and it is harming or killing a wildlife. In that situation, the plastic pop, whatever you call it, and the seagull are being harmed. Another bigger way that it's being harmed is through our litter dumps. So some people will utilize our wildlife areas as a place to dispose of their trash or their couch or their fridge. And these litter dumps might get so sizable that they're actually degrading our wildlife habitat. Maybe not affecting one species particular. We might not see that litter and that wildlife interacting directly. It's harming that wildlife habitat, and it's removing habitat from our wild places for our wildlife to thrive. So that's point 2. Point 3 is what a lot of people don't think about, and I didn't think about it until I was the intern that was picking up the litter. But for one summer, my only job was going out every day to the wildlife areas and picking up the trash. And I kept thinking, and you know, everybody's got to do it, right? You got to get that appreciation. But I kept thinking, man, if nobody littered, think of how much time our wildlife professionals would have to do research, to build habitat, to remove our invasive species. Think about all the time and the resources that we would have. So not something that affects our wildlife, but indirectly totally affects it, because we are, a lot of our staff is out there cleaning up these areas. We're paying their salary, and they're using their time to use that, and it could be used for a lot better things than picking up this trash. So I always describe it as that triangle, that threefold effect. And so when you're talking about people, about keeping their places clean, that's something that to remind people of. Maybe it's convenient to you to throw your McDonald's cup on the ground, but think of all these ways it's affecting people and our wildlife. So we always encourage people, just the smallest things are really having the biggest effect on our wildlife here in Ohio.
And then lastly, we want you to get outside and enjoy, right? The more and when I do talks to kids and parents, I'm like, I tell kids, the more you get outside and enjoy nature and understand it, right? When we understand something is when we are moved to want to protect it, to want to enhance it, to want to make it better. But we have to understand it first. And the only way to really do that is be outside and enjoy it. So we really enjoyed being here with you today. This is our contact information. You can take a picture of that slide if you would like. If you had any questions for us, or we were happy to entertain any questions you guys might have today. We really thank you being here and have enjoyed doing this talk together. It's for our first mother-daughter talk together. So, yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. If anybody has any questions, we're happy to answer them now, or we can hang out afterwards and talk as well.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Do we have deer wasting disease in Ohio? And if so, or even if we don't, are there any? How do you control that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we have 2 primary, what I would say, deer diseases here in Ohio. They often get confused. One that you might start hearing about soon, we actually just had to talk to my uncle in Columbus about this because he has this prevalent on his golf course. But it's called EHD. So it's an acronym for what's called epizootic hemorrhagic disease. And that disease is very quick in development. It happens this time of year. It happens when we don't have a lot of rain and we're entering that late summer drought. So it happens in August and early September. And basically what's happening is the deer are being concentrated toward limited water resources. And around those water resources are a type of midge. And the midge is biting the deer at that water resource and transmitting this EHD disease to them. And it's very unfortunate for the deer because it's very hard to watch them suffer. Essentially, they get a very high fever. They start to hemorrhage inside. It's an always fatal disease. So it's very sad for anybody to see. And the deer suffers through that for about a couple weeks before it dies, but they always die in water or near water because they get this fever and they're overheating and they need drink. So they almost always die in or near water. The plus side of that disease is it only lasts August and early September. That is a very short window. When we get our first frost and it kills off all those midges, it goes away, and the deer population rebounds. When they go through the breeding season in the fall and when they have their fawns in the spring, the deer population in that area will rebound immediately from that disease. So the plus side of that is they die in a very short window. It's not affected through the whole year, and they're able to rebound the next year or the following year after that. The other disease that we have is...
Wait, that disease is not transferable to humans. It is something only for hoofed animals. So cattle can be susceptible too, but it's not going to be transferable to humans at all. Neither one of these diseases are.
Yep. So it was one that you might start seeing in the news around this time of year. The other one is called CWD, which is chronic wasting disease. This is a newer, I say it's very new to Ohio, and it's even newer from a nationwide standpoint within the past 50 or so years. But that CWD is completely different from EHD. It's a very slow, sad death for the deer. It's always fatal. It comes from a misfolded protein, so it's a neurological disease. The deer get a misfolded protein it's called a prion, and they ingest it through the landscape, or they transfer it deer to deer, or it's transferred in the womb as well. And that deer will suffer with that disease for a few years before it shows symptoms. So it's kind of like a blind disease. It happens, we don't see it until the very end, and then you see a deer walking in circles or acting very strange, and the only way we can find out if they have that is through a testing to show if they have it. That is very new to Ohio within the past few years, and this is also a way of showing how important hunting is, because CWD happens where there's an overpopulation of deer. When we have too many deer in one place and they're interacting with each other, they'll transmit this CWD and then they'll carry it across the landscape. So this happened in a high concentration where there's an overpopulation of deer in Wyandotte County. So it's restricted to Wyandotte, Hardin, Allen, and Marion counties right now.
Right. Oh, I lost it. It's gone. It must have died.
Well, it's near Marion.
Yeah, it's basically North of Marion, west of Bucyrus, over towards Lima, about that area. It's a very restricted area.
So we do have CWD here in Ohio. It's not transmittable to humans. If you need a concept to understand it, it's very similar to mad cow disease. A lot of us have heard of that before. It's very similar, but it's in the hooved animal. So here in Ohio, we're looking at the deer. So it is a disease that is still in its early stages of research. They're still trying to find out what the best course of action is all across the states. So it's something that we're battling with modern day today as well. But a huge component to preventing the spread of that disease is hunting, trying to keep those deer populations at a healthy level. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
About the browse line, we have learned and seen in our woods the invasive species called the Asian honeysuckle, which just seems to take over in places. But it doesn't seem like the deer are eating or killing them. Is that an accurate perception?
Yes. So a lot of our invasive species, first off, they take over very well because they do well with that disturbance. So when you're seeing the browse line disturbance, or even if it's not affected by a deer, if construction company comes in and does a clearing, one of the first things you'll see pop up is that honeysuckle. They thrive well in that disturbance area. But not just honeysuckle, monoflora rose, a lot of our other invasive shrubs, they are not nutritious for all of our native wildlife, not just deer. Some of them have berries that the birds can utilize or certain things, but when the deer are targeting out vegetation to eat, they are targeting some more native species that are higher in nutrient compounds. That is because everything that existed in Ohio prior to bringing over those non-native species all exists in harmony. Everything has certain things that they eat. They rely on these native species. They all rely on each other. So the deer are relying on our native species. So the honeysuckle, they will eat them, but it is a last resort. So there's like this tier of things that they want to eat, and that's more near the bottom. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That's good.
If they get very desperate, they will start to eat that honeysuckle. You will see that happen, but that is characteristic if there's a heavy drought or something and the other plants aren't surviving as
Or
well.
a bad winter.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a question about buffalo and bison. You did mention that, I think it was in the prior to 1803 slide. How prevalent were bison and or buffalo? Maybe they're the same thing, I'm not quite sure.
They are.
Okay. Like were there a lot of them or was it just kind of sparse?
Right.
And then I have a question about emu, but.
Okay. So for bison, so buffalo is really the domesticated term for bison. The wild term is bison. And yes, the large numbers, the huge numbers that you saw, that big mountain of skulls, that was all west of the Mississippi because they really are a prairie animal. They're an open land animal. They are not a forest animal. So in Ohio, right, we talked about it being 95% forested at that time. And then we had a few very big open prairies. And actually Oak Openings, which is west of Toledo, was oak savanna prairie. So yes, there was trees there, but the oak trees, like somebody described to me what savanna means. Basically, it means you could drive a vehicle in between all of the trees, right? Like they're very spread out. They were huge oak trees, but they were very spread out, allowing the grasslands to grow up. So Oak Openings was an area where bison were heavily found. And then more like in western Ohio, there was a lot of great prairies down there. We had these splashes of prairies in and amongst the forests. And where those big prairies were, where bison were found. We don't have actual numbers of how many bison were in Ohio because the records were just poor back then. But we can determine from the fact that the majority of Ohio was forested. They're not a forested species. So yes, we had bison, but certainly not to those huge numbers that they had out west in Nebraska, Kansas, where that was all prairie, right? They had all prairie out there. That's the habitat that they subsisted in.
Native American economy wasn't necessarily based on the buffalo the way it was further out in the.
Correct. In Ohio, Native Americans, they obviously would use buffalo or bison if they got one. But yes, when we heard about Native Americans being nomadic with the bison herd, right, because they thrived on that, that was just a way of that tribe learned to survive using the bison. That wasn't so much the case in Ohio.
Okay, then my other question, I think it was from when I read The Sixth Extinction, which was a book from a while back, and I think there was a huge bird that was down in Kentucky, right south of Cincinnati, and I don't know if it was called the emu, but I didn't notice any large birds that you showed in the pre-1803 in Ohio. Is that familiar at all, or?
So
It was killed for meat through, so it never
right.
made it through.
Yeah, I honestly, there is a bird called the emu. Off the top of my head, I didn't think the emu was native to North America.
Yeah.
Another bird in Kentucky that was very
Right.
large.
A
Right.
relative.
Yeah, a relative similar to that.
I wouldn't.
I don't believe we had anything like that in Ohio.
I was just curious.
Yeah, no, I don't think there was any type of bird like that in Ohio. I mean, certainly we have Our large land birds would have been like the sandhill crane, is the only thing that I can think of that actually is a very tasty meat. But many of those birds, those larger wading birds, like the great blue heron, the great egret, sandhill, well, not so much the sandhill cranes, maybe the sandhill cranes, they were shot. They shot a lot of those birds, not so much to eat, but for feathers, right? So when you think back to those old pictures of ladies all dressed up in their fancy dresses and their fancy hats, many of them had those feathers. And so they harvested a lot of those great egrets and great blue herons because they were after those decorative feathers. So that was kind of, those are the largest standing birds that I know of in Ohio that were kind of, they obviously weren't extinct, but their populations were definitely hurt through harvesting for their feathers.
Well, thank you. Very nice presentation.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you.
You're welcome. All right.
Thank you very much, Kelly.
All right.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.